The thunder rolled across the Montana sky as Nora Zimmerman fell to her knees in the mud, her hands covering her face as tears streamed down her cheeks. The barn, her father's barn, the last piece of him she had left in this world, lay in ruins before her, its weathered beams splintered and broken after the violent storm that had ravaged her small ranch the night before. The year was 1887, and at 23 years old, Nora now faced the impossible task of salvaging what was left of her family's legacy alone. She didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats through her sobs, didn't notice the tall figure dismounting from a chestnut mare until his shadow fell across her crumpled form. "Madam," the voice was deep, tinged with a southern drawl. "Are you hurt?" Nora looked up through tear-blurred eyes to see a man standing before her, broad-shouldered and trail-worn, his hat tipped low over his eyes. She'd seen him ride through town once or twice, but never spoken to him. The drifter who'd taken odd jobs at neighboring ranches these past few weeks. "It's gone," she whispered, gesturing helplessly at the destruction. "Everything my father built, just gone." The stranger surveyed the damage, his expression thoughtful beneath the brim of his hat. Then he knelt beside her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. "Name's Isaac Brennan," he said, offering a calloused hand. "And this barn ain't gone, madam, just broken for the moment." Nora wiped her tears with the back of her hand, too proud to take his. "It doesn't matter now. I can't fix this. Not by myself." Isaac stood, his gaze traveling from the collapsed structure to the small farmhouse beyond, then back to Nora's tear-stained face. His expression softened as he extended his hand again, this time not to shake but to help her to her feet. "We'll rebuild it together tomorrow," he said with quiet conviction. "Tonight you rest. Dawn brings new beginnings." Nora stared at him, this stranger offering help when she needed it most. Slowly, hesitantly, she placed her hand in his and allowed him to pull her to her feet. Little did she know that tomorrow would bring more than just the rebuilding of a barn. The first pale light of dawn was just breaking over the eastern hills when Nora heard the sound of horses approaching. She stood on her porch, coffee cup in hand, her honey-blonde hair hastily pinned at the nape of her neck. Part of her hadn't believed the stranger Isaac would return as promised. Yet there he was, leading not only his own horse but a wagon loaded with lumber and tools. Behind him rode 3 other men, ranch hands from the neighboring properties. "Morning, Miss Zimmerman," Isaac called, tipping his hat as he dismounted. "Hope you don't mind, but I brought some friends." The men introduced themselves: Frank Porter, the blacksmith's son, Eduardo Martinez from the cattle ranch to the east, and old Tom Wilson, who'd worked alongside her father years ago. Each nodded respectfully, uncomfortable but determined. "We heard about what happened," Tom said, his weathered face solemn. "Your pa was a good man, helped us all at one time or another." Nora swallowed the lump in her throat. Since her father's death 6 months ago, the isolation had been near unbearable. Neighbors checked in occasionally, but never like this. Never with purpose. I don't have much money to pay you all," she admitted. Isaac shook his head firmly. "Not asking for payment, madam, just doing what neighbors ought to." The men set to work immediately, clearing the debris and salvaging what they could from the wreckage. Nora worked alongside them, refusing to be a bystander on her own property. By midday, the skeleton of the original structure had been cleared, and the foundation for the new barn began to take shape. As she worked beside Isaac, passing him nails and holding boards in place, Nora found herself studying him, the careful precision of his movements, the quiet way he directed the others without demanding. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle from years of hard work. "You've done this before," she remarked as he perfectly notched two beams together. "My pa was a carpenter back in Texas," he replied without looking up. "Taught me everything he knew before the fever took him." "I'm sorry," she said softly. He shrugged, but she caught the flicker of old pain in his eyes. "It was a long time ago, been wandering ever since." "Is that why you came to Silver Creek? Just passing through?" Isaac paused then, looking at her directly for the first time since morning. Something in his gaze made her breath catch. "Was passing through," he corrected. "Now I'm not so sure." The conversation ended there as Frank called for Isaac's help with raising one of the main support beams, but his words lingered in Nora's mind as the day wore on. By sunset, the frame of the new barn stood proudly against the darkening sky, not complete, but a promise of what would be. The men declined Nora's invitation to stay for supper, all except Isaac, who lingered as the others rode away. "You don't have to feed me," he said, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana. "You've worked just as hard as any of us today." "It's the least I can do," she insisted. "Besides, it gets lonely eating alone every night." A shadow crossed his face. "I know something about that." In her small kitchen, Nora found herself oddly nervous as she prepared a simple meal of stew and cornbread. This was the first time she'd invited a man into her home since her father died. The propriety of it should have concerned her more than it did, but there was something about Isaac Brennan that inspired trust. Over supper, she learned he was 31, had fought briefly in the closing days of the war as a boy, and had spent the years since working his way westward. He spoke little of himself, asking instead about her life, her father, the ranch. "Pa homesteaded this land when I was just a girl," she explained. "Mama died birthing my brother, who didn't survive either. It was just the two of us after that." She stared into her coffee cup. "When the pneumonia took him this past winter, everyone expected I'd sell and move to town, maybe find a husband. But you didn't. This land is all I have left of him, of them all." She looked up, chin raised slightly. "I won't give it up without a fight." Isaac nodded slowly. "Your determination does you credit, Miss Zimmerman. Please," she said, surprising herself, "call me Nora." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Nora, then." After supper, he refused her offer to make up the sofa, insisting on returning to his room at the boarding house in town. At the door, he paused, hat in hand. "I'll be back tomorrow," he promised. "We've got a barn to finish." True to his word, Isaac returned each day for a week, sometimes alone, sometimes with one or two of the others. The barn took shape under their hands stronger than before, with improvements Isaac suggested that would help it withstand future storms. On the 7th day, as the last of the roof was being secured, Nora brought lemonade out to the men. She handed a glass to Isaac, who had just descended the ladder. "It's magnificent," she said, gazing up at the completed structure. The new barn stood tall and proud, its fresh timber glowing honey gold in the afternoon sun. "Your father would be proud," Isaac replied, drinking deeply. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, and Nora had the strangest urge to wipe it away. Instead, she clutched her own glass tighter. "I can't thank you enough. All of you," she added, looking around at the other men. Old Tom clapped Isaac on the shoulder. "Don't thank us too much. This young fella did most of the planning and the hardest work. We just followed orders." Isaac looked embarrassed. "That's not true. Everyone pulled their weight." After the others had gone, Isaac helped Nora move her 2 horses and the milk cow back into the barn. She watched as he gently led her father's old plow horse, Thunder, into his stall, speaking softly to the animal as he secured the gate. "He likes you," she observed. "He doesn't usually take to strangers." "Animals can sense intention," Isaac replied, stroking the horse's muzzle. "They know when someone means them no harm, and people," she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Can they sense intention too? His eyes met hers across the dim space of the barn. Some better than others. Later, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, they sat together on her porch steps, a respectable distance between them as they drank coffee and watched the sky change colors. "What will you do now?" Nora asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Now that the barn is finished." Isaac stared into the distance. There's always work to be found for a man willing to do it. He glanced sideways at her. "Your fence line on the north pasture could use some attention." Hope flickered in her chest. "Are you offering? If you'll have me, I can't pay much," she warned. "Room and board would be fair," he suggested. "The boarding house in town is expensive, and your ranch needs a lot of work. More than you can manage alone, if you don't mind me saying so." Nora considered his offer. Having a man stay on her property would raise eyebrows in town, but the practical benefits were undeniable. And something about Isaac made her feel safe rather than threatened. "The old bunkhouse behind the barn needs work," she said finally, "but it could be made comfortable enough." Isaac's smile was like sunrise after a long night. "I'll start on it tomorrow." Over the following weeks, Isaac became a fixture at the Zimmerman ranch. True to his word, he repaired the bunkhouse to a habitable state, though Nora insisted he take his meals with her in the main house. He fixed fences, mended the roof on the chicken coop, and helped her break ground for a larger vegetable garden than she'd been able to manage alone. Word spread through Silver Creek that the Zimmerman girl had taken in a drifter as a ranch hand. Some whispered about impropriety, but most of the townsfolk, knowing Nora's stubborn independence and the dire straits of her ranch, merely nodded in approval at her practical solution. On Sundays, they rode into town together for church services. The first time, Nora had been nervous about the gossip, but Isaac's respectful manner sitting a proper distance from her in the pew, tipping his hat politely to the church ladies, soon quieted most wagging tongues. If anything, his presence beside her seemed to grant her a protection from the matchmaking efforts of well-meaning townswomen, who had been pushing various eligible bachelors her way since her period of mourning, for her father had officially ended. One Sunday in late May, as they rode back to the ranch after services, a comfortable silence between them, Isaac suddenly spoke. "The McAllister place is up for sale." Nora glanced at him, surprised. The McAllister ranch bordered her property to the west, a nice parcel of land with good grazing that had been abandoned when old McAllister died the previous year. "Sheriff mentioned it after church," Isaac continued. "Said the banker's looking for a buyer before the county claims it for back taxes." "Are you thinking of buying it?" Nora asked, an unexpected tightness in her chest at the thought of Isaac settling so near, yet not under her roof. He shook his head. "Don't have that kind of money saved." "But it got me thinking." He trailed off, seeming uncharacteristically hesitant. "About what?" Isaac reined his horse to a stop, and Nora did the same. They had reached the ridge that overlooked her property, their vantage point revealing the patchwork of pastures, the gleaming white farmhouse, and the sturdy new barn. "About putting down roots," he said quietly. "I've been drifting so long, I forgot what it feels like to belong somewhere." Nora's heart quickened its pace. "And now I'm not so sure that wandering is what I want anymore." His eyes met hers, direct and unguarded. "These past weeks here, they've meant something to me, Nora." She swallowed hard, unable to look away from the intensity of his gaze. "They've meant something to me too." Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing since the day he found her crying beside her collapsed barn. But neither moved to close the distance. both aware of the complications, the potential for gossip, the vulnerability of Nora's position as a woman alone. "We should get back," she said finally. "Clouds are moving in." Isaac nodded, though his eyes lingered on her face a moment longer before he turned his horse back toward the trail. That night, as a gentle rain pattered against the roof, Nora lay awake in her bed, thinking of Isaac out in the bunkhouse, wondering if he too was awake, thinking of her. The propriety she'd been raised with warred with the loneliness that had been her constant companion since her father's death, a loneliness that had begun to fade since Isaac's arrival. The rain continued for 3 days, keeping them mostly confined to indoor tasks. Isaac repaired furniture in the house while Nora caught up on mending and preserving the early summer vegetables from her garden. They worked in companionable silence or conversed easily about books they'd read, places Isaac had seen in his travels, memories of Nora's childhood on the ranch. On the evening of the 3rd day, as they sat before the fireplace after supper, the rain still drumming steadily on the roof, Isaac asked about the photograph on the mantel. "Is that your mother?" Nora nodded, rising to retrieve the faded image, taken on her wedding day. She was 17 when she married Pa. She handed him the photograph, their fingers brushing momentarily. Isaac studied the image of the young woman with Nora's same honey blonde hair and delicate features. "You favor her. Pa always said so." Nora resumed her seat, tucking her feet beneath her skirt. "I wish I remembered her better. I was only 5 when she died." "My mother died when I was 12, Isaac offered, his voice soft with memory. "Feels like having half your heart cut away, doesn't it?" The understanding in his words brought unexpected tears to Nora's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Exactly like that." He returned the photograph to the mantel, then surprised her by retrieving a battered tin type from his shirt pocket. "My folks on their wedding day," he said, handing it to her. The image showed a handsome young man with Isaac's same strong jaw standing proudly beside a petite woman with kind eyes. "She was beautiful," Nora said, carefully returning the photograph. "She was the best person I've ever known." Isaac tucked the image away. "She's the one who taught me that a man's true measure is in how he treats those who can't repay him." "She taught you well, then," Nora replied, thinking of how he'd come to her aid when she had nothing to offer in return. Their eyes met across the small space between their chairs, and for a breathless moment, Nora thought he might reach for her hand. Instead, he stood abruptly. "It's getting late," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "I should let you get your rest." Nora rose as well, oddly disappointed. "Of course. Good night, Isaac." At the door he paused, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the darkness beyond. "Rain's letting up. I'll ride into town tomorrow, see what I can learn about the McAllister place." "Why?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "You said you couldn't afford to buy it." He turned, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "No, but you might. With a partner." Before she could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Nora staring after him with her heart hammering against her ribs. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the world washed clean by the rains. Isaac rode out early, leaving a note saying he'd be back by supper time. Nora spent the day distracted, turning his parting words over in her mind. A partner. What exactly had he meant? She was hanging laundry on the line when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, she spotted not one rider but 3 Isaac, accompanied by Sheriff Jenkins and Mr. Fulton, the banker. Nora wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly conscious of her work dress and wind-blown hair as the men dismounted in her yard. "Miss Zimmerman," the sheriff greeted her, tipping his hat. "Brennan here has an interesting proposition he wants to discuss with you." "Thought it best if Fulton and I were present," seeing as it concerns property matters. Confused but curious, Nora invited the men inside. Once they were seated at her kitchen table with coffee before them, Isaac cleared his throat. "I've been talking with Mr. Fulton about the McAllister property," he began. "As you know, it borders your land, and it's good grazing territory that would complement what you already have." "I could never afford it," Nora said, shaking her head. "Not alone, perhaps," Mr. Fulton interjected, "but with a business partner the bank might consider it a sound investment." "What partner?" Nora asked, though she was beginning to understand. "Me," Isaac said simply. "I've saved some money from my years of work. Not enough for the whole property, but enough for a down payment if combined with what equity you could leverage from this ranch." Nora stared at him. "You want us to buy the McAllister place together, as business partners, yes?" Isaac met her gaze steadily. "You need more grazing land if you ever hope to build a proper cattle herd. The McAllister place has water rights to the creek and good shelter for winter. Together, we could make both properties profitable." Sheriff Jenkins, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "It's a solid plan, Nora. I've known your family since before you were born, and I know how hard it's been since your pa passed. This could be the saving of your ranch." "But," Nora looked from one man to another, "wouldn't it seem improper? A single woman entering into business with a man who's not family." The banker smiled thinly. "Hence our presence here today. All contracts would be properly drawn up and witnessed. Sheriff Jenkins has offered to serve as an informal guardian of your interests, and the pastor has agreed to do the same." "I don't need guardians," Nora said, bristling slightly. "No, you don't," Isaac agreed, surprising her. "You're more capable than most men I've known. But the world being what it is, having respected members of the community vouch for the propriety of our arrangement would protect your reputation." Nora considered his words carefully. The practical advantages were clear. The McAllister land would indeed make her struggling ranch viable. And working alongside Isaac, these past weeks had shown her that they made a good team. But there was more to consider. "May I speak with Mr. Brennan alone for a moment?" she asked the other men. When the sheriff and banker had stepped outside, Nora turned to Isaac, who remained seated at the table. "Is this truly just about business for you?" she asked directly. Isaac held her gaze, something warm and unspoken passing between them. "No," he admitted quietly. "But it's a start. A way for me to stay that won't compromise your standing in the community. And if the partnership doesn't work out, if we find we can't agree on how to run things, then I'll sell my share to you at a fair price and move on." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I'm not trying to take over your life, Nora. I'm offering to build something alongside you, as partners." "For now," he said, the slightest hint of a smile touching his lips, "the future can take care of itself." Nora took a deep breath, searching his face for any sign of deception or hidden motives. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "All right, let's discuss the details with Mr. Fulton." The following weeks were a flurry of activity. Papers were drawn up, boundaries walked, and plans made for how to integrate the two properties. To avoid any appearance of impropriety, Isaac moved from the bunkhouse into the small cabin on the McAllister property, though he still took most of his meals with Nora. Together, they cleaned out the McAllister house, airing rooms that had been closed up for over a year, mending fences and preparing for the small herd of cattle Isaac had arranged to purchase from a rancher further north who was retiring. It was exhausting work, but Nora found herself happier than she'd been since before her father's illness. The land that had seemed like such a burden, too much for her to manage alone, yet too precious to abandon now, felt full of promise again. June turned to July, and the summer heat settled heavily over the valley. Nora and Isaac established a rhythm of work that suited them both, each respecting the other's strengths. She handled the accounts and the garden, while he managed the larger livestock and the more physically demanding tasks. They shared decisions about improvements and investments, sometimes disagreeing, but always finding compromise. On a particularly sweltering afternoon, they were repairing the irrigation channel that ran from the creek through both properties, when Nora lost her footing on the muddy bank and slipped into the water. It wasn't deep, but the current was strong enough that she struggled to find her footing on the slippery stones. In an instant, Isaac was beside her in the water, his strong arms around her waist as he lifted her back onto the bank. They both collapsed on the grass, laughing and soaked to the skin. "Are you all right?" he asked, still holding her loosely. Nora nodded, suddenly aware of their proximity, of his hand still at her waist, of how his wet shirt clung to the muscles of his chest. Their laughter faded as their eyes met, and in the hushed moment that followed, something changed between them, something that had been building since that first day by the ruins of her barn. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Isaac leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, and over almost before it began. He drew back, watching her face carefully. Nora touched her fingers to her lips, her heart racing. "Isaac, I've wanted to do that since the day we finished the barn," he confessed, his voice husky. "Tell me if it wasn't wanted." Instead of answering with words, Nora reached for him, her hands finding his face, drawing him back to her. Their second kiss was deeper, an answer to questions they'd both been asking silently for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. "I think I've been falling in love with you since the moment I saw you crying beside that collapsed barn," he murmured. Nora closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the rightness of his words. "I think I've been falling in love with you since you said we'll rebuild it together." They returned to work shortly after, conscious of appearances despite the isolation of their location, but something fundamental had shifted. The business partnership that had brought them together had become a bridge to something deeper, something neither had been looking for but both had found. That evening, as they sat on the porch of Nora's house watching fireflies rise from the grass, Isaac took her hand in his. "I want to court you properly," he said, "with the community's knowledge and blessing." Nora's heart swelled at the sincerity in his voice. "I'd like that." "It won't be easy," he warned. "There will be talk. Some will say I set this whole thing up to get your land." She squeezed his hand. "Let them talk. We know the truth." The following Sunday, they rode into town for church services as usual. But this time, Isaac formally requested permission from Pastor Green to call on Nora. The pastor, who had witnessed their business agreement and had observed their respectful behavior over the past months, gave his blessing with a knowing smile that suggested he'd seen this coming long before they had. The town's reaction was mixed, as expected. Some, particularly the older women who had known Nora since childhood, clucked disapprovingly at the speed with which the relationship had developed. Others, who had watched Nora struggle alone after her father's death, seemed relieved that she had found both practical help and companionship. Sheriff Jenkins proved an unexpected ally, shutting down the worst of the gossip with firm reminders of Isaac's honorable conduct and the proper legal arrangements that had preceded any romantic attachment. Through it all, Nora and Isaac continued their work on the combined properties, now with the added sweetness of stolen kisses and honest conversations about their hopes for the future. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch reading aloud to each other, or Isaac would play simple tunes on the harmonica while Nora mended or shelled peas. As July turned to August, Isaac began making improvements to the McAllister house, not just practical repairs, but touches that made it more of a home. New curtains appeared in the windows, a fresh coat of paint on the porch railings, flower beds cleared of weeds and ready for planting. One evening, as they walked the property line between their two ranches, Isaac stopped beneath the sprawling oak that marked the boundary. "I've been thinking," he said, taking both her hands in his, "about the future." Nora's heart quickened. "What about it?" "When we started this partnership, we agreed to keep our properties separate, your ranch still yours, the McAllister place mine. But I'm wondering if that's really what we want long term." She studied his face in the golden light of sunset. "What are you asking me, Isaac?" With a deep breath, he dropped to one knee before her, still holding her hands. "I'm asking if you'd consider joining more than just our lands. I'm asking if you'd marry me, Nora Zimmerman, not for convenience or property, but because I love you more than I ever thought possible." Tears sprang to Nora's eyes as joy bloomed in her chest. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "yes, Isaac Brennan, I'll marry you." He rose to his feet and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left no doubt of his feelings. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained, sliding it onto her finger. "Pa gave it to me before he died, said to save it for when I found a woman worthy of it." Nora stared at the delicate ring, then back at Isaac's face. "I'll treasure it always," she promised, sealing the words with another kiss. They decided to marry in October, after the cattle were sold, and the harvest was in a practical decision that also allowed time for a proper courtship in the eyes of the community. Pastor Green announced their engagement the following Sunday, and gradually, the last of the skeptics came around as they witnessed the genuine affection between the couple. September brought the cattle drive, with Isaac and hired hands taking their modest herd to market in Helena. Nora insisted on going along, much to the surprise of the other drovers. Isaac merely grinned when she appeared dressed in split skirts and a sturdy jacket, ready to ride. "Never doubted you'd come," he told her privately as they set out. "Wouldn't have it any other way." The drive was hard work, dusty days and cold nights, with the constant vigilance required to keep the herd together. But there was joy in it too, in the camaraderie around the campfire, in the sense of building something together that would sustain them through the years ahead. When they returned with more money than either had seen at one time, they immediately reinvested most of it in improvements that would make next year's herd larger and healthier. But Isaac insisted they set aside a small portion for their wedding and for modest comforts for their future home. "Which house will we live in?" Nora asked one evening as they discussed the wedding plans. "Mine or yours?" Isaac considered the question thoughtfully. "Which would you prefer? Your house has more memories, more of your family's history. But yours is newer with that big kitchen you've been fixing up." She hesitated. "Though it feels strange to leave my father's house empty. What if we didn't have to choose?" Isaac suggested. "The McAllister place would make a good home for a foreman and his family once we can afford to hire one, and eventually." He looked at her meaningfully. "Eventually," she prompted, though she knew what he was thinking. "Eventually we might need more room, for little ones." Nora blushed but didn't look away. "I'd like that. Children running between both houses, making them into one big home." He kissed her then, tender and full of promise. "That's exactly what I was thinking." As their wedding day approached, the women of Silver Creek rallied around Nora, helping with preparations and offering the kind of maternal advice she'd missed since her mother's death. Mrs. Jenkins insisted on hosting a small gathering where they presented Nora with a handmade quilt, each square sewn by a different woman from the community. "So you'll know you're not alone anymore," the sheriff's wife explained as Nora ran her fingers over the intricate stitching. The gesture brought tears to her eyes. "I haven't felt alone since the day Isaac found me by that collapsed barn," she admitted. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, with the aspen trees glowing gold against the blue Montana sky. They exchanged vows beneath the oak tree that marked the boundary between their properties, symbolically uniting the two ranches as they united their lives. Nora wore her mother's dress, carefully altered by Mrs. Jenkins and the other women. Isaac wore a new suit, looking so handsome that Nora's breath caught when she first saw him waiting for her beneath the tree. The entire town turned out for the celebration that followed, with tables set up in the meadow between the two houses and lanterns strung in the trees. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, and a sense that something right and good had happened, that two broken pieces had come together to make something stronger than either had been alone. That night, after the last guests had departed and they were finally alone in the house that was now truly their home, Isaac took Nora in his arms with a reverence that brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Mrs. Brennan," he murmured against her lips, "do you know how long I've waited to call you that?" "Since the day we finished the barn," she suggested with a smile. He shook his head, his eyes serious despite his smile. "Since the moment I saw you kneeling in the mud, refusing to give up even when it seemed hopeless. I knew then you were someone special. And I knew you were someone special when you didn't just offer sympathy, but rolled up your sleeves and said, 'We'll rebuild it together,'" she replied, touching his face gently. "That's when I started to hope again." Their first night as husband and wife was everything Nora had dreamed of and more tender and passionate, filled with discoveries and promises whispered in the darkness. As she drifted to sleep in Isaac's arms, she felt a contentment so deep it seemed to touch her very soul. The first year of marriage brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Winter settled over the valley with unexpected ferocity, testing their preparations and resilience. But the barn that Isaac had built stood strong against the howling winds, and the houses, both the Zimmerman homestead where they lived and the McAllister place, they were slowly renovating, provided warm shelter through the long, cold months. They established new traditions, reading aloud to each other by the fire on winter evenings, Sunday dinners with friends from town, Isaac playing his harmonica while Nora sang the songs her mother had taught her as a child. Spring brought the miracle they'd both been quietly hoping for, the news that Nora was expecting their first child. Isaac's reaction, a mixture of joy and terror, made her laugh even as happy tears streamed down her face. "I don't know the first thing about being a father," he admitted that night, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. "And I don't know about being a mother," she replied, "but we'll learn together, just like we've done everything else." As Nora's pregnancy progressed, they hired Tom Wilson's son Robert as their foreman, settling him and his young wife in the renovated McAllister house. The arrangement worked well, giving them the help they needed while allowing Nora to focus more on preparing for the baby. In late November, as the first snow dusted the valley, Nora gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth, Sarah for Isaac's mother and Elizabeth for Nora's. She had Isaac's dark hair and Nora's blue eyes, and from her first squalling cry, she had both her parents wrapped around her tiny fingers. "She's perfect," Isaac whispered, holding his daughter with hands that trembled slightly. "How did we create something so perfect?" Nora watched them, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain. "The same way we rebuilt that barn," she said softly, "together." The years that followed brought more children, twin boys, Michael and David, born 2 years after Sarah. And finally, another daughter, Emma Grace, who arrived 5 years later, a surprise blessing when they thought their family was complete. The ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, gradually expanding as neighboring properties came available, and their reputation for fair dealing and quality livestock spread. They added orchards and expanded the gardens, built a new creamery and a larger chicken house. The original barn, the one Isaac had built that first summer, remained the heart of the ranch, expanded and improved over the years, but still standing as a testament to the day they'd begun rebuilding not just a structure but two lives. When Sarah was 10, a late summer storm threatened to damage the barn again. As thunder crashed overhead and rain lashed against the windows, Nora found herself standing at the kitchen window, watching anxiously as Isaac and Robert secured the livestock and reinforced the doors against the wind. Sarah came to stand beside her, pressing close against her side. "Is Papa worried about the barn?" she asked. Nora smiled, remembering another storm long ago. "No, sweetheart. That barn is strong. Your father built it to last." Later, when Isaac came in drenched but satisfied that everything was secure, he found Nora sitting by the fire, mending one of the boys' shirts. "Reminds me of when we met," he said, hanging his wet coat by the door. "Except this time nothing collapsed." Nora set aside her mending and went to him, still as drawn to him after 11 years as she had been in those first days. "Do you ever think about how different our lives would be if you hadn't ridden by that day?" Isaac pulled her into his arms, not caring that his clothes were still damp. "I try not to. Can't bear to imagine my life without you in it. I was thinking about what you said that day," she murmured against his chest. "We'll rebuild it together tomorrow. Did you have any idea then what we'd end up building together?" He tilted her chin up to look into her eyes. "Not specifically, no, but I knew I'd found something worth staying for." He kissed her softly. "Best decision I ever made, stopping to help the pretty girl crying beside her collapsed barn. And the best words I ever heard were 'we'll rebuild it together,'" Nora replied, returning his kiss with one that held all the love and gratitude of their years together. On the 15th anniversary of the day they met, Isaac surprised Nora by taking her to the oak tree where he had proposed. Their children, now old enough to understand the significance, had helped him prepare a picnic beneath its spreading branches. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small wooden box. Inside, Nora found a delicate gold locket. When she opened it, she discovered a tiny fragment of wood preserved under glass on one side and a miniature photograph of their family on the other. "The wood is from the original barn," Isaac explained. "I saved a piece when we rebuilt it, to remember where we started." Tears filled Nora's eyes as he fastened the locket around her neck. "It's perfect," she whispered, touching the precious keepsake. "Our whole story in one small space." As they sat beneath the oak tree that day, surrounded by their children and the land they had nurtured together, Nora reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the despair of that storm-ravaged day to the fullness of the life they'd built, it had all begun with a collapsed barn and a stranger's promise. "What are you thinking about, Mama?" Sarah asked, noticing her mother's contemplative expression. Nora smiled, reaching for Isaac's hand. "I'm thinking about how sometimes the worst days of our lives can lead to the best ones, if we're brave enough to keep going." Isaac squeezed her hand, the same understanding in his eyes that had been there on that first day. "And if we're lucky enough to find someone to rebuild with," he added softly. "Together," Nora agreed, leaning against his shoulder as they watched their children play beneath the golden autumn sky. And in that moment, with the past preserved in the locket at her throat and the future embodied in the children before her, Nora knew with absolute certainty that their story, which had begun in tears beside a ruined barn, had become something more beautiful than either of them could have imagined on that fateful day so many years ago. A love built to weather any storm, standing strong and true like the barn they had rebuilt together.